We are here to talk about industrial software, but before we kick off, let me just introduce the event. So I'm Andre Kuknin. I had the European Equity Research Team here at Credit Suisse in London. We're part of a global team, of course, and our colleagues, some of our colleagues are joining us on this call. On this call, all of us at Credit Suisse are really pleased to have the opportunity to host this meeting with Cambashi, global market research and analytics experts focused specifically on the engineering and industrial software markets. In particular, we're joined by Alan Griffiths and Simon Hailstone, who are lead analysts on this space at Cambashi. The plan for today is for me to make a very short intro on just why we're here, why this is important for industrial automation, hardware guys that we cover mostly, as well as the software direct implications for some of you on the call who look at across the market. And then I'll pass over to Alan and Simon to really take us through the nitty-gritty of these markets, evolution, key trends, what's changed compared to when we talked about this a year ago at a similar event. And then we'll follow by Q&A. We're happy to make it interactive, so you can raise your hand as we go to ask a question. You're also very welcome to email us any of your questions, but we'll make sure there's time for Q&A at the end as well. In terms of why we're here and why this is important, firstly, what we're planning to cover is the industrial and engineering software markets and the key players. This includes manufacturing software, which is the key core segment with manufacturing CAD, manufacturing computer-aided engineering, PLM, CAM, computer-aided manufacturing, and then also the BIM side of it, the building information modeling design software. This webinar will provide a detailed review of these kind of core software market segments, as opposed to the previous couple of events that we hosted that focused on specific areas of industrial software, such as industrial IoT and BIM in particular. Why is this important for us as Credit Suisse Capital Goods coverage team that focuses primarily on hardware players, and why is this important more broadly for anyone who plays in the market? Firstly, it's the clearly increased focus on digitization post-COVID. This was a trend that was already there before 1st of January 2020, when the world started to change very quickly. It's now clearly boosted. And hence you've got, one is the growing market to be addressed and hence opportunities for investors. Secondly, and really key for us, is that we're finding evidence that the customer choices of hardware are becoming increasingly more influenced by the hardware vendors' digital and, as a projection of that, software capability, and hence it is important for any incumbents in the hardware space. Related to that is the second area that we have been highlighting now for a number of years, again before COVID and probably boosted by COVID, as I'll come on to in a second. It's this notion of hardware versus software and who it's who, or as we before talked about, kind of software eats the world and hardware buys software to counter this. The value added in industrial space is clearly shifting towards software, as we see increasingly happening, and as it follows the more of a consumer space examples. This is because the devices are becoming increasingly generic, as we find, with more sort of development of common communication protocols, clearer specifications, such as companion specs, all this basically attacking the vendor in and vendor lock-in. And the hardware players are naturally responding to that, at least in Europe and the US, with capital allocation decisions and acquisitions and partnerships in software, something that was clear before COVID. And I think the biggest hardware to software deals have come through actually since COVID, with Schneider Vivo OSI or the latest Hexagon acquisition, to name just a couple. And I won't steal Cambashi's thunder on this. That's why we think this is critical. And with this, and without any further ado, I want to pass on to Alan to introduce Cambashi, give us a bit more detail on what we're going to talk about exactly here, and to take us through the details of these markets.
Okay, thank you, Andre. And very quickly, just to reinforce what Andre said about what we're covering, on the left is what's in scope specifically, and on the right are other areas that we cover, but we've left out of scope for this presentation. So we're focusing on the manufacturing software and BIM software for design purposes. Quick history of Cambashi. We're based in Cambridge, been going for 35 years or more, and this has always been our focused area. So we have a lot of history going back. We can see a lot of trends. We know a lot about companies pre-acquisition and post-acquisition, so we can agglomerate a wide data set of information. Bashi means bridge in Japanese, by the way, which is that we had a Japanese connection which brought that into play. Clients are mainly companies operating and providing software in this area, but we also, from time to time, do provide information on companies and growth, etc., to investors. And we haven't mentioned them here because they normally don't want to be mentioned. This is the main analyst team. It'll be myself and Simon today. We've had Petra on previous calls, and the other guys are involved in creating the data sets and the graphs that you'll see today. So what we want to cover is how the CAD/CAM, PLM, CAE, BIM design market is recovering as we emerge from the pandemic. A quick background to how we do our methodology, which is important because we have developed over the years a way of really creating a lot of information from sometimes quite sparse data, and it's important to understand how we do that. Then we'll talk about growth projections in different areas and some trends and takeaways. So what we called observatories are the areas, the data sets that we use to show to store and cross-reference the information we have. And there are two critical ones: the technical software market and the employment data. Oops, sorry, I've got the wrong deck here. Let me just close this. Sorry about this.
No worries. And I think just to say that I think these slides will be available to send around after the presentation. So we'll send it to everyone. And yeah, if anyone wants to request it specifically, let us know. But I think we'll send it to everybody who's on this call.
That's better. Sorry about that. So we have over 400 products from over 100 providers, and they're some of the segments that we cover. 58 countries and 112 industries over that period of time. The Employment Observatory is separate, but it is used to triangulate and to feed the methodology. I'll just let Simon talk a little bit about this methodology, because Simon is actually our Director of Research, and he's been involved in developing this and enforcing this technology over a number of years.
Thanks, Alan. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'll get through this pretty quickly because we really want to get on to the meat of this, and nobody's really interested in methodology. But as Alan said, we've been doing this for a long time, and the core of what we do is really a multiple input methodology. We're bringing in our own research of all of those multiple providers that you just that Alan just talked about, software providers, and a few others, multi-industry providers. So we do our own research, very comprehensive research, and we do that on a continuous basis from a variety of sources, public sources, and also how can I put it, not so public sources, that lead into providing us with revenue and user and trend information, based on those software providers. But the importance here is that we're not just taking single inputs from surveys or web research or whatever. We're using a whole variety of inputs. So, for example, we do use some pretty heavy economic inputs from the likes of Oxford Economics, for example. We do look at the demand side of things on the basis of looking at where industries are going, what trends are, and so on. And we also pull in data from public sources, from national statistics bodies, and so on. Andre, you just talked about total value add and so on. So that's one of our inputs among many others, including investment statistics and so on. So all that gets piled in on a very detailed level into this process. And Alan talked about employment just then. Well, employment is extremely important as one of those constraining pieces of information that says what really is the capacity out here for selling this kind of software. Have we actually got enough people out there who can actually buy this at a certain price? And therefore, that sets a kind of upper bound on the economy of this particular sector. So, Alan, can you go to the next slide, please? So, when we talk about software providers, this is a non-exhaustive list, but these are the key providers that we have in our research portfolio. There's a big chunk called ZZ Others at the end there. That's a hugely long tail of providers that we also research. And as you can see, it goes across the whole range here, from everything from construction and AEC type of technologies through to some quite detailed simulation tech and so on. Can you go on to the next slide? Thank you. And I mentioned employment just then. So, we talk about market potential. Here's an example of the sorts of data that we've got available to us. This is an example for the BIM sector. It's really interesting to look at the information at this level because historically, the sorts of providers that we've just seen on the previous list have focused very much on the design domain, and today we are focusing on that on this webinar. But there is a huge untapped opportunity for usage within the overall construction life cycle, which BIM covers, for example. So you may have 6 million architects and designers out there in the world, but you've got several 100 million who are part of that whole life cycle who can both consume and create data. So in terms of market potential, employment is a really interesting metric to take, and we've got some great data that feeds into that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Alan, do you want me to talk to this one first, and then you can chip in? Yeah. Okay, so here's some headline numbers for technical software revenue. So this is showing CAGR from 2020 to 2025, and we're currently showing for this particular sector, which includes BIM design and manufacturing design software within the scope. We're showing a CAGR of over 9%, between 9 and 10%, which is still pretty healthy. There are some individual sectors and individual providers, of course, who are actually exceeding that, of course. But I think if we go back and look at where we were at some points in the early stages of COVID and so on, some of these sectors and some of these vendors were not looking quite this healthy. So I think this is looking as an overall market statement, it's looking very healthy. You can see at the bottom of that slide, can you just go back a minute? Thank you. The bottom of that slide, the key players that we're seeing, obviously in manufacturing, Dassault Systèmes are clearly, still a huge presence in this market, along with Siemens. But we do need to take into account that some very domain-specific vendors such as ANSYS, who are extremely strong, of course, in the simulation area, are really significant players in this, getting on for $15 billion market in 2020. And on the BIM side, obviously the big player is Autodesk, and we'll talk a little bit more about Autodesk in a moment. But we need to bear in mind that there are some other significant vendors. Hexagon is one. Bentley, of course, had their IPO last year, and they're starting to move into some interesting new spaces. Thank you, Alan. So if we look at this in terms of some key industries, so if we look at that CAGR broken down by industry, we can see some key areas there that are still looking to be projected at double-digit growths. And we've picked out three here because they're really, quite interesting. So AEC as a whole has been, construction tech and the whole BIM movement has really shown some quite aggressive growth and some very interesting market movement over the last couple of years. And we're seeing that obviously the AEC market is going to continue to do that. We've picked out aero and auto out of this because if you go back over a year, 15 months or whatever, aero and auto were looking like two really quite severely affected industries. And particularly aerospace with the on the commercial aerospace side of things, with the decline in travel and so on. So we were seeing some real impact on software vendors who had a very heavy dependency on that particular industry. But interestingly enough, the recovery looks to be pretty good for those vendors and the technical software industry within those industries. And this is partly due to the acceleration of the whole digitalization of those industries. They've always been leading edge, but things seem to have accelerated quite significantly in those industries. And automotive in particular, of course, is now heavily being driven by new technologies, the whole case type of initiatives that is going on in automotive through connectivity and autonomy and so on. So we see that actually those two industries will pull out of the of what we thought was going to be a pretty dire situation within those industries at the beginning of last year. It looks a little bit more healthy now. Okay, next slide, Alan. So if we look at what we actually said last year versus what actually occurred, it's almost slightly embarrassing this because forecasts in such volatile environments as last year are pretty horrendous. So in fact, when we come to analyze the scope that we're talking about today, BIM design actually, did grow around about the same kind of level that we thought it was going to, which was in the the upper single digits of growth. Manufacturing, interestingly enough, did better than we expected. We were expecting a lot more impact in some of those industries I just mentioned, but also in the whole industrial manufacturing sector and the impact that was going to occur due to supply chain issues and so on, which is still rolling itself out, of course. But actually, the manufacturing sector seemed to have done a little better than we forecast, but at a much lower growth rate than the construction sector, and also at a much lower growth rate than historically there had been. So next slide, Alan. So, of course, as I mentioned, there is variation by vendor in where we thought things were going to go and where they've actually ended up. So we're going to look at one or two of these key vendors in manufacturing, for example, to see where they ended up in terms of their growth or their declines within the scope of what we're looking at. Okay. So if we look at Dassault first, so I'm sure a number of people on this call are familiar with Dassault System and the breadth of their portfolio. And if you look at their headline performance for last year, it was outstanding. But of course, most of that outstanding performance came from their life sciences division that did, funnily enough, exceptionally well as a result of the pandemic. So that's not included in the scope for discussion today. We're just focusing on the manufacturing design parts of their portfolio. So their industrial innovation sector, their core offerings, things like CATIA and Innovia and so on, did take a bit of a hit because of their strong connections with certain industries. Now, excuse me, in particular, automotive and in industrial automation. There are some other things going on, of course, with Dassault, with their SolidWorks offering and the potential shift of their user base into their 3D experience platform and so on, which is having some near-term impact as we see it on some of their revenue streams. But overall, SolidWorks did pretty well, really, given that most of that base is really in some of the core industrial machinery sectors. Now, one interesting takeaway from this was that actually Dassault did surprisingly well in aerospace, which was it was a surprise to us. But part of that is, I think, reinvestment in new digital technologies. Part of it, we believe, is also to do with the unwinding of existing deals that were coming through anyway during that 2020 period. So it kind of buffered that industry a little bit from some of the other declines that we were expecting to see. Okay, Alan, next one. So PTC is a really interesting company. They made a transition to a subscription-based licensing model starting back probably really in about 2016, and they rolled out the completion of that in 2019. So some of the growth that you're seeing here is due to the unwinding of the full ARR that they started to recognize during 2020. But they did do pretty well organically, actually, and their both their CAD and their PLM offerings started to strengthen again, which was pretty good. I just want to call out one area that's not in scope for today's discussion, which is their whole IoT and in particular their augmented reality offerings, which grew substantially during the pandemic because a number of companies started to realize that they could do a lot of remote training, remote maintenance, and so on using these AR technologies. And it's undoubtedly a point of strength for PTC and some other vendors, I have to say. But it's clear that the pandemic has accelerated for some companies, some industrial companies, the use of these technologies. So that's definitely a continuing area to watch. One other aspect of this also is that PTC made two very interesting acquisitions of Onshape, which is a cloud-based CAD environment, and Arena, which is a cloud-based PLM environment. And it's clear that PTC sees the total future as being SaaS and cloud-based. And this is a big statement. We've seen other companies. Dassault made a big commit to this some years ago. Autodesk is well on the path towards that destination. So I think and some of that's been accelerated again because of COVID, the whole cloud-based approach. Alan, do you want to shift on to the next one? ANSYS, ANSYS are a really interesting company. They have been on an acquisition path for as long as I can remember and continue to do so. They are both plugging holes in their capability and enhancing their capability. They did do actually surprisingly well in auto, but that is partly because of the strengthening digital transformation and digital thread movement within those industries. Simulation is becoming a huge part of this entire environment, and it's also partly driven by the need for additional simulation capabilities to support things like autonomous vehicles, for example. So we're seeing a lot of movement in that area on the simulation side. Very interesting market still to watch, and ANSYS seem to continue to perform very well. Alan, next. Okay. Actually, Andre, is it worth me just taking a breath here, see if there's any questions arising at the moment?
Yes, why don't we do that? Let me just check, audience, if there are any questions. If you do have questions, then you can raise your hand and we'll see it, or you can unmute and go. If you're on the phone, you can press *6. And you can email us as well. I'm in front of my mailbox as well as Iris. I don't think we have questions at this stage, so Simon, back over to you.
All right, thanks, Andre. Thank you. So I think we're going to move on to BIM players. What we've seen in 2020. Autodesk always, well, it continues to surprise, I have to say. Having made that huge transition to subscriptions and so on, they are continuing to grow both through acquisition and organically. Of course, they do skew these numbers somewhat because they are still the largest player in these markets at the moment. And even though there are some significant players, Bentley, Hexagon, Nemetschek, and so on, are not insubstantial companies, compared with the Autodesk presence. It's they do tend to skew the market a little bit. So they are doing very well, both on the design side, but also I would say that although this is out of scope for today's conversation, I mean, obviously they've made huge investments in the construction technology sector, which is a really fast-growing area, and that has been a big focus for them. But of course, if you capture some of the downstream stuff, you also both capture new upstream design markets, but also secure those design markets if you can show completeness of life cycle coverage. So, again, it's really interesting to see the direction that most of these BIM vendors are moving in. Excuse me. I think we're going to go through a little bit of quick detail on some of these. So Autodesk just really talked about, extraordinary growth, really considering, can we get the next slide? I'm very aware at the time we got through. Nemetschek are a very solid company in this particular sector. They have a diverse portfolio. They have also started to invest quite strongly in both the construction tech and the operation side of the life cycle. Within the design sector, they have, of course, have quite a breadth of within their portfolio. They did get hit pretty early on last year, and some of our early forecasts thought that maybe the bounce back would be a little bit stronger. In fact, the H1 was a bit poor for them. H2 looked a little bit stronger. They're looking pretty secure at the moment, but not in the same kind of league in terms of growth that we're seeing from some other players. Alan, thank you. Bentley, I really want to talk about Bentley for a bit because they did their IPO last year. That sent them off on some interesting journeys of acquisition. Mainly, they tend to focus and have historically focused on relatively conservative acquisition approach, and they've used it to patch specific areas of gaps in their offering, or to serve specific user areas. This year, or over the last year, they acquired a company in the subsurface simulation area, and that's a big one. Actually, I think it's clear that if you're gonna build anything, you need to know what's going on under the ground. And Bentley have made I think quite a good strategic acquisition there. But we've also seen them grow organically very well. They've been able to provide their cloud offerings, their iCloud offering, quite extensively. They've got a very good collaborative offering project-wise, and they're very strong in areas such as civil infrastructure, power generation, and networks, and so on. All of these things are, really key, key sectors for them. But they're also growth sectors. So the power sector, for example, is going through and will continue to go through a major transition as things move obviously to more sustainable sources. And Bentley have got some very good offers in that area. So Bentley are doing pretty well. Okay, let's just see how the markets performed compared with where we thought they were going to go and how they've actually ended up in 2020. So this is the combined forecast for BIM design and manufacturing. And as you can see, there was, unsurprisingly, a dip in 2020. It's not as severe as we thought it was going to be. And excuse me. In fact, it got worse during 2020, but in fact, it recovered a little bit to pretty nearly where we thought it was going to be in our forecast from last June. I just want to let's look forward a bit to say, well, what's going to happen? We are expecting a upper single digit growth profile this year across these sectors, and increasing actually in 2022 as things finally roll out. But then that we don't see that as being a particularly sustainable growth profile, and we see things settling down a little bit to that kind of upper single digit growth profile for this overall sector. It's noticeable that is quite a few points lower than pre-COVID. Now, I should just say that 18 and 19 we did identify as being quite exceptional years, and there were some interesting provider-specific events that went on in the market during that period, such as, for example, Autodesk's winding out of their subscription transformation. So that injected a little bit of artificial growth into those years. Okay, Alan, I'm very aware of the time. We need to keep going. So this is our forecast for manufacturing design software, hitting around about 9% this year, peaking probably next year in the kind of 11 to 12% rates. We think, there's a lot of currency fluctuation going on out there. in some key geographies. So if you look at things against everything against the US dollar, the euro is doing some very interesting things. The yen is doing some interesting stuff at the moment. So this is based on the current currency forecast from Oxford Economics. But there is some currency factor in here that you need to bear in mind. There is some interesting specific areas. So high tech, for example, is looking quite strong. And obviously with the chip shortage and so on at the moment, there are some interesting challenges for that industry, and there could be some squeeze on the high tech industry. But actually, from a technical software point of view, in terms of particularly the simulation environments and so on, it's looking like there actually could be some near-term upside for that industry. Thank you, Alan. We've pretty much covered most of what's going on here. The BIM design, and also through into the whole BIM construct and operate area, is looking very strong going forward. We are seeing a lot of players making acquisitions. We're seeing a lot of players moving into new areas, expanding into new areas, and so on. And one thing we should talk about here is the increasing overlap between BIM design and manufacturing. The whole area of off-site construction, of prefabrication, and so on. There's a huge movement towards this, and it's definitely a space to watch as these two areas collide. It's very interesting, and you have to say that potentially providers such as Autodesk are well positioned for this, as they cover both areas pretty well. But Dassault are making some pretty interesting inroads into this area, and have actually registered some very interesting new wins in the AEC sector in 2020. Okay, Alan. Alan, do you want to pick the thread up again here and just talk to some of the broader trends?
Certainly, thank you, Simon. So underlying a lot of this, a lot of the elements that Simon's talked to have been related to digital transformation of some sort. And as Andre said at the beginning, that's not new. It goes back quite a long way. But the forcing remote working and alternate supply chains and different ways of working has accelerated the process. And we've really seen that by talking to individual providers and just by seeing what's going on in the market. So, and remote working, the shift to the cloud has just moved on. Probably 10 years have compressed into 1 or 2. Subscription licensing is a big trend, and collaborative working is part of that as well. And just an example of digital transformation, to bring into play something which people talk about quite a lot, but what that really means. When people talk about a digital twin, in a factory, this goes from the model of the design of that factory, through simulation of the way the factory works and the way individual components behave within that, through to that's on the modeling side. In the real world side of the twin, you're looking at ERP and MES systems which control the real world manufacturing processes, and technologies like IoT which connects them to each other and to software sources, along with analytics, of course, which go in with them. And all of those technologies are increasingly needed to be integrated to provide a solution. And this feeds into the need for the ecosystem and for increasing collaboration between vendors So other takeaways we would add there, and we found this employment observatory that Simon talked about at the beginning very interesting to go into specific analysis in areas that we are quite slightly outside the normal ones, to give us and our customers a good idea of the untapped market, because ultimately software, unless it's lights out automation software, is dependent on some sort of user. And by analysing the employment types, we can look at the number of people that are available and who may want to use that software, which sets an upward bound and a possibility of the extent that software can grow. And of course, the massive number of mobile devices, even down to shop floor workers, frontline workers in construction, etc. These are a potential, along with connected clothing and devices, to connect the frontline workers, which has previously been untapped. Major vendors are expanding their portfolios. We've seen a lot of M&A activity in the last couple of years. And coming back to the ecosystem again, a lot of partnering, because that's the only way you'll get these complex solutions delivered. And driving some of this are all the new technologies which are emerging, electric vehicles, any sort of connectivity, factory connectivity, even things like compressors and actuators will have software in them, often controlled by some application and linked with others, and often using AI and machine learning and other techniques to, for example, do predictive maintenance. And the scope of simulation is growing very rapidly. As Simon mentioned, ANSYS is a good example of that. But to get the full benefit of that, they need to work closely with providers like PTC, who provide the modelling, and ultimately to get it into the end products and to develop the digital twin, we'll be using IoT and AR and other connected applications.
Alan, can I just say one other thing about simulation? One thing that did emerge from the from last year and the pandemic is the increased use of simulation for a whole raft of things, and particularly within the BIM context. So quite a lot of companies now doing simulation of obviously of built environments. They always were, but they're doing it much more on the basis of safe distancing, of spread of vapor and so on, of control, of designing and automating the design of controlled environments and so on and so forth. So that is something that was already starting to emerge, and it has accelerated. The other area is also people flow through public spaces. So that's another area, an interesting area that a lot of the BIM simulation people have been looking at. So I think there are quite a few things that have accelerated in the last year related to that whole area.
Thank you, Simon. I'll hand back to you, Andrew, in case there's any questions or clarification needed.
Great. Thank you very much to both of you, Alan and Simon, for taking us through this really fascinating presentation. So I think from my side, if I were to just pick out a couple of things that I found particularly interesting and standing out here is, firstly, I'm glad to see that we're on the same page in terms of the importance of digital adoption, what you're hearing from your customers that are corporates, and what we're hearing from others and from our companies is the same. And the post-COVID trends on remote everything and shift to cloud, to subscription as well. I think your message on the BIM outlook is very interesting. It is something that we have been exploring with you, and it's something that I think is backed up by valuations of newly IPO'd entities such as I guess Bentley, and also to an extent by Schneider's acquisition. And really, lastly, that focus on simulation. It's something that you were quite early to highlight to us, and I think you're really pounding the table on this now. So that is certainly of interest to me, and maybe leads to a question that, if I may start with that, and then we'll open up to audience, is that clearly ANSYS is very strong in this, as you said, as your data shows. Kind of who's next in simulation who are strong after ANSYS, whether from across your data set?
Well, okay. I'll turn on consultant mode and say that depends. Yeah, it does slightly depend on the sector. So there are, if you look at Siemens, for example, I've got a very comprehensive simulation offering across a whole range of segments, and right the way through from early stage systems engineering through technical testing and so on, through to the full, heavyweight fluid dynamics and all that stuff. So Siemens have got a very strong, comprehensive offer that they have been building over years, in the same way that ANSYS have. But at the same time, we shouldn't, dismiss the likes of Dassault. Their Simulia offering is really very, again, pretty comprehensive. And it certainly serves them very well in their core market sectors in aero and auto, for example. So, it is a bit the usual suspects from the whole kind of CAD/CAM CAE area. I would pick those two out, but yeah, also have to bear in mind that I guess the next one that I would pick out would be Altair.
Right.
They're a really interesting company. So if you start analysing their revenue streams and so on, they have some time had a combination of, obviously, the pure software side of things, which again is very comprehensive, but they also have been a long-term advocate of high power computing, for example. So effectively, they were in the cloud simulation game, probably before most. And you should also remember that they have a big services arm to their business, and I can only see that as being a strength for them, actually, because some of this stuff is so complicated and so involved. You need some really smart engineers and analysts and so on to really, get this stuff right. And although a lot of companies like ANSYS, for example, have been making it simpler for, your average designer to get quick analyses, for some of this other more advanced stuff and so on, they are really going down that route in an interesting way. I mean, I could keep going on the list. MSC, for example, which is part of Hexagon, got some, very interesting offers in there, particularly, for example, we haven't talked about autonomous vehicle simulation, but that's a huge area. So, lots of opportunity there. That I think they're probably the big guys who are in the market.
Thank you very much. I can ask another whole bunch of follow-ups on this, but I'm going to stop and just check if there are any questions to audience. Yes, from audience here. So I'm just checking if there are any hands raised. And, box. think no. So maybe since we have time, so as a follow-up to simulation question, so in the context of overall manufacturing software market growing, sort of settling at that sort of 8% that you presented in outer years from kind of around 9, 10 in the near future, how much faster is simulation growing within that? The ballpark.
Got on the mute there. That's a good question. It is, well, okay, first of all, historically, it has been growing faster than traditional CAD CAM. Mm-hmm. I think there has been a bit of a resurgence in the CAD business as new capabilities come on board, as more integrated capabilities come on board, as to be frank, as customers are looking to either upgrade software or to potentially move providers because of, for example, the completeness of offering. So I think it's true that simulation is going to continue to outperform, raw CAD. Mm-hmm. But I think, if we look a little further beyond, into a 3-year time frame, maybe things will even out, and part of that's going to be due to the blurring of lines between design and simulation as we move towards pure, the real digital twin vision. Simulation is absolutely a core part of that because you're linking the physical and the digital, and if stuff is being reported back on the physical, you want to say, what's going on here? I'll simulate that, or I'll simulate that to see if that's going to cause a problem, and then that's going back into the design loop and so on. So that whole integrated closed loop environment is going to drive both of these things, both CAD and simulation. But my expectation is, as more big compute power becomes available to everyone because it will be in the cloud, I would expect simulation to continue to be out there. What's interesting is we're not seeing too many. I would say we're not seeing too many kind of new kids on the block in this area, startups and so on. It's a tricky one to get started and traction on. So anything that's new, I would suggest, is coming from niche areas. So we talked about electronics and so on. There are lots of players in things like electromagnetic radiation and all that kind of stuff. I expect to see them start to maybe start to figure a bit more, and anything of course related to simulation around energy consumption, battery technology and so on. Anybody who's got anything like that, if they're a small company, I think you can expect them to be hoovered up pretty quickly by one of the bigger players.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. I have got a question here, actually, that goes along the lines of something that we have discussed before with Alan and colleagues. So you follow the whole suite of software players comprehensively with varied types of ownership. From speaking to customers of these software players, do you sense any distinction between attitude towards privately held or publicly listed companies, or indeed software companies that are part of large hardware conglomerates or linked to them?
Wow, that's a good question.
So the question is, when you speak to users of software, is there a difference of saying, well, PTC is a standalone and Siemens is part of a large conglomerate, and maybe at the same time Bentley until recently was a private player? Do you get any sense in difference in attitude from the users?
I mean, Alan, please jump in on this. I don't think that the public-private, distinction. I'm trying to think if I've ever really heard of anybody, calling out that distinction. I mean, you'll always get groups of users who might be a little bit disenchanted, suggesting that they're not interested in us; they're only interested in their stockholders. But that's a generic statement almost. So I don't think it particularly applies to this sector. I think the thing that really drives most users is value. I know that's probably a cliche, but I really think it is. They want to see that their software provider is continuing to deliver the value that they need, that provides the capability that they need to do to get the job done better and better every single time, and that just knowing that they can talk to people within a vendor who they're knowledgeable, they're there to service the customer and not just going to talk to them about technology. So I would say that's still, you have to remember that the users, not necessarily the purchasers of the software, not necessarily even the budget owners, but the users of this software are, primarily engineers and technically oriented people. So they have a very strong view about what they expect from vendors. I don't know, Alan, if you want to add to that.
I was in a position where I worked for several software companies, and I worked for a medium-sized software company in the CAD/CAM area that was taken over by one of the big vendors. And my observation from that, and from looking at others, is the distinction is more between big and small rather than private versus public, because I've seen similar features of large public companies and large private companies, i.e. they tend to be while increasing your scope of sale, globally and with marketing and with cross-selling, etc., they do expect higher margins, and they will often reduce the offering and focus down on the profitable ones. Whereas small private companies tend to be a bit more quirky, or small companies, whether they're public or private, I guess, they tend to be, but they're normally private, tend to be a bit quirky, and sometimes they follow lines that are not immediately profitable because they believe that it might come off one day. And so you can see a little bit more specialized attempts at commercialization, I guess. So I would say it's more between big and small rather than public and private.
It's very helpful. Thank you. We're on the hour, so we will respect your time. I'm just going to pause for one more second to see if there are any last minute questions here. I haven't got anything on the email. So with this, I would like to thank both of you very, very much for your interesting presentation and for your time. I think we all learned quite a lot from it, and certainly provide us with a lot of food for thought in terms of how we approach the software players, and certainly the attitude towards software from hardware players that we cover directly here at Credit Suisse and the Cap Goods team. So thank you, and wishing all of you a great rest of the day and rest of the week. Thank you for joining us. If you have any follow-ups, please reach out directly.
Thank you for inviting us, Andre.
My pleasure.